The five conditions I outlined, when those conditions are present, they increase the possibility that deconversion will occur.
I resonated a lot with those conditions. Have you seen anything where those conditions would be present and where people haven't deconverted? What have you seen that actually helps people? Welcome to the podcast. If you're doubting or deconstructing, you're in the right place because Truth Snack journeys with doubting Christians toward confident faith. Recently, I came across an article that laid out a 5-step model for deconversion. What was kind of scary was how much I resonated with it. I wanted to know more, so today I'm talking to the author, Joel Furches. Joel has an undergrad in psychology, a master's degree in education, which focused on special education, and is currently working on his PhD towards psychology, with hopes of actually publishing the research we'll discuss today. Listen, if you're doubting, I think Joel's research will help you make sense of the journey you're on and hopefully offer you some hope for how you might journey toward faith again. Enjoy the discussion.
In the 2010s, I was a journalist doing a column for an online publication which focused on religion. One month, I decided to do an article a day about atheists who had been converted to Christianity. Sort of a human interest piece. It's a redemption arc, so it's the kind of thing that generates interest. And I was right, it did generate interest, a lot of interest. But it wasn't just from Christians reading it to get the warm and fuzzies. I got a lot of feedback from atheists as well. And as one might imagine, their feedback was not positive necessarily. Of the many things that they said, one of the frequent ones that I got was, why don't you do a balanced publication and talk about the Christians who became atheists? That way we've got both sides. Now, that wouldn't have been appropriate for the column that I was writing because it was a Christian column. But as I was doing the conversion stories, my psychology background kind of began tingling as I noticed that there were trends, there were ongoing features wherein these conversion stories started to sound very similar to each other. And so, because that was so interesting to me, I went back and I took all of the conversion stories that I'd written and used them as the basis for a case study on how atheists convert to Christianity. And I thought, you know what? It would be interesting to do the reverse. How do Christians become atheists? But as I started to look at the deconversion stories, I was kind of blown away with how much similarity occurred between these stories. The depth of trends and similarities that were occurring within the deconversion stories were way more than the conversion stories I had done. So much so that within, having read, say, a dozen of the deconversion stories I was researching, it got to the point where I could predict the next step because they all were so similar. And it was at that point that I constructed my model. And then I began to look at the literature in the field, and mine was the only stage model that I could find. It was a tunneling stage model where the person would have to go through this particular stage to reach the next stage. Some stage models give kind of a general, this is the type of thing that happens on the way to the conclusion. But a tunneling stage model, you kind of have to pass through each stage to get to the next one.
That's really interesting. And I think it's especially fascinating that you were able to predict kind of the story arc, for maybe lack of a better term, of where these people's stories were going. Would you mind just like walking us through those 5 stages of deconversion? Like, what were those patterns that you saw, and what did you call them, and what do they mean?
Sure. So the first stage in my 5-stage model is the setting conditions. This is basically my interest in what is the setup that the person comes from when they're deconverting. Like, do all deconverts have similarities within their backgrounds, or can you take Eastern Orthodoxy, Catholicism, Pentecostalism, non-denominational, all of them and get deconverts from them without any similarities. Again, this is a case study, so I'm looking at specific people who have provided their deconversion story in a variety of formats, whether those be interviews they've done or blogs they've written or books they've written, just a variety of things. I wouldn't take the smaller, quicker stories. I was looking for people who'd retold their stories several times so that I could pick out the elements of the story that would repeat. So I looked at these stories and looked at background information for the people, where they were coming from. And as one might predict, there were a lot of similarities in the backgrounds of the people who were going through this deconversion process. So that was the setting conditions. The next stage in my model would be stressors. Now, stressors are the kinds of things that would cause you to doubt your faith. Whether those be, say, I lost my job, I can't find a job, I keep praying, why does God not answer my prayer? Or I pray for a parking spot, sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. Maybe that's coincidence and not an answer to prayer. Or, wow, there's a lot of contradictions in the Bible. How do we reconcile all of those? Stressors could be a variety of things, but ultimately it's anything that causes you to question your faith. Following that, I had the trigger. The trigger is what would take you from not asking those questions to actually asking the questions. Some event or instance in your life that causes you to take all of these stressors and say, why don't I actually examine these and ask the questions? What if what I'm believing is not true? Let's take a look at that. Again, when somebody tells their story, they're telling it like a story, and stories have an arc. So you have an arc where, there's rising action, and then there's a point, and then falling action. And as they tell their story, they always mention that point and then talk about all of the questions they were asking in the next stage of the model, which is the processing, which is actually asking those questions, going through the process of questioning my faith and tearing things apart, changing positions perhaps. And that's the processing. And then the final stage is the deconversion. The deconversion event is when they give themselves, or most of them will say, I just kind of woke up one day and realized, you know what, I don't believe anymore. It's just this kind of dawning sense that, hey, I actually am not a Christian. I don't believe in a God, kind of thing. And that when they have that dawning sense and they're willing to at least identify internally as being an atheist or a non-believer, that's the point at which deconversion has occurred.
I hope we can come back to kind of each of those, or at least parts of each of them. I think it makes sense as a model, and as I kind of even chart my own past doubts onto it, I can identify some of those things. But I was particularly almost surprised when I read an article of yours online about the setting conditions, because I resonated with 4 out of 5 of them. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, this is like scary that you're kind of in my head and really saying things that I had identified and have kind of worked through in some sense. So I would love for you to talk about the 5 setting conditions specifically, because I think there's a lot of insight there. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Certainly. The 5 conditions, basically, I gathered these from the stories that I read and then wrote up. Because, a person who is telling about their deconversion experience is going to mention their religious background. Especially they're going to mention the things that they found unpleasant or they found suspicious or whatever within their background. So if I eat a bag of chips, then that increases the probability that a glass of water will be a positive stimulus for me, right? It increases the possibility that I will go to the kitchen to get a drink. If I am in classroom and I'm drinking a big bottle of water, every sip I take increases the possibility that I'm going to go to the bathroom, that I'm going to behave in such a way as to go to the bathroom. So these are things that exist that increase the possibility of a behavior. So these setting conditions the 5 conditions I outlined, when those conditions are present, they increase the possibility that deconversion will occur. And I was able to identify 5 which were recurring in the stories. These stories I read, they would have at least one of these 5 features, frequently more than just one. Let's see, we'll start with isolationism. And isolationism is this idea where you are sort of kept on the farm, if you will. You're discouraged from engaging with people or ideas outside of your existing worldview. So watch VeggieTales, but don't watch Paw Patrol. Go see the latest Christian movie, but don't go see an R-rated movie, definitely, or really any secular movie. Definitely don't go see Harry Potter, because that's got magic and witches and so forth. And make sure all your friends are Christians, because you don't want to be corrupted by those non-Christians. When you do kind of youth events, make sure you do them with your youth group at the church, or at a designated location where all your youth group are going to be there. This kind of thing. You're isolated to your Christian sphere, and you don't have much contact with media or individuals outside of the Christian sphere. Another one that I noticed, we'll call this number 2, is spiritualism. Now, this was interesting because what I noticed was there was a heavy emphasis on the supernatural in these religious backgrounds. The 2 denominations I found that produced the most deconverts in terms of the stories I'd read are Pentecostalism and Catholicism. Now, those don't seem to have too much in common with each other doctrinally, but one thing they do have in common is a heavy emphasis on the supernatural, on things like miracles, on things like ecstatic religious experiences, but also, churches that heavily focus, inordinately so, on issues like end times events, like prophecies of the end times. When's the Antichrist coming? Could it be this person? And there's angels and demons lurking around every corner. It's just, the world is fundamentally supernatural. We just can't see it, but we kind of have to infer it from what's going on around us, kind of thing. So that's the spiritualism. It's a heavy emphasis on the supernatural. The next one I'll bring up would be what I called textualism. Textualism is a legal term which talks about kind of sticking to the letter of the law and not trying to read between the lines. I'm using it to refer to a very wooden literalism when one looks at the Bible. You look at the Bible, you try to read it as literally as you possibly can. And this would result in things like creationism, sort of a 6-day creationism, 6,000 years ago kind of thing, without any wiggle room whatsoever. But it might refer to things like, having to somehow make the mustard seed the smallest seed in existence to cause Jesus to be correct when he talks about that. You have to, well, you get the idea, literalism.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just interject there to say, yeah, I mean, that is one of the ones that was really the case. Like that, yeah, that verse would really bothered me, like genuinely bothered me, that, Jesus says the mustard seed is the smallest of the seeds, and that's not true. So that, yeah, became a stressor for me. So I definitely resonate with that.
The number one cited cited stressor in all of the cases that I've ever read was problems with the Bible. This was a real problem for me, that there were contradictions in the Bible, that there were this, that, and the other. And why would those be such heavy problems unless you had been told by your religious environment that either the Bible is 100% literally true or God doesn't exist? Those were your 2 options. And when those are the only options on the table, and the Bible is not, in fact, 100% literally correct, then what other option do you have? You got to go for God doesn't exist kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, again, I'm resonating with that so much, that it's not just that the Bible is authoritative, it's that our understanding of it is authoritative. And to diverge from that is to diverge not just from that interpretation, but from Christianity. It's a step away from faith entirely. It's funny that I was never taught that explicitly, but I caught that. It was in my system for sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, very interesting. Okay.
Probably the most surprising one that I was able to find, and it took me a little while to wrap my head around this one, was what I call compulsory certainty. And what I mean by that is that your religious environment tells you that in order to be a good Christian, you have to be certain about your faith. You have to be certain about the truth of Scripture. You have to, you know, have at least very high confidence in the things that you believe. To have less than absolute certainty is seen as kind of a spiritual weakness. Oh, what, you're not entirely certain about going to heaven when you die? You're not 200% certain about resurrection of Jesus, whatever. You've got to have this absolute or total certainty, and anything less than that is a sin, if you will. And then the fifth one would be behavioral control. It's a situation in which your environment has absolute control over your behavior, or at least high influence over your behavior through things like shaming you, or, in some cases, praising those individuals who are extremely consistent with the behavioral norms within that environment. But the more you diverge from those behavioral norms, the more the environment kind of directly discourages you. And the interesting thing about church environments is that the person who is undergoing this sort of shaming or difficulty with the way in which their religious environment handles their behaviors is also participating in that themselves. And I can give you a couple of examples. One that sticks out in my mind is a woman that I heard an interview with. She had been part of a movement called the Quiverful movement. And the Quiverful movement has a lot of, it tries to really push the kind of what they would call the biblical model of family to the extreme, such that it would be the wife's responsibility to have as many children as she possibly could, which is where the term quiverful comes from. It's a blessing to have it's a blessing to have children, and blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them, something like that. It's a quote from the Bible. But the quiverful movement also stressed that, the man had to be the head of the household and the protector of the wife and children and so forth. So this woman kind of fell into this movement. And then as a result of falling into the movement, she kind of pushed her husband to take over the family finances, which she had managed before, and to become the head of the household, to go out and get a job and provide for the family, and she would stay home and do the wifely things. And she started having as many kids as she possibly could, which became a medical difficulty for her. And she found that every church environment that she went to wasn't, strict enough on the beliefs that she had. So she started her own church in her house, which of course she pushed her husband to lead. Again, you notice she's pushing her husband to do a lot of things that he didn't volunteer to do. And then she started an organization promoting the Quiverful movement and started publishing a widely regarded newsletter on this movement. And she ended up deconverting after this became a real stressor in her life. But notice she was the one who kind of formed the environment that she found aversive.
So you're kind of saying that the behavioral control dimension of it is really a social system of the churches. Yeah. And I feel that too. And you hear that from a lot of people who are doubting or deconverting. The dysfunctional social elements can be highlighted. And that's quite common you see online. So to me, this just speaks to that. And it's fascinating that you're saying it becomes like self-sustaining, in that even the people who don't like it are taking part in it, because we all want to be accepted in the system by others, right?
You see this also in the case of, his name is escaping me, but you'll recognize the individual. He wrote the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye.
Josh Harris, I think.
Yeah. Josh Harris. And so he was sort of one of the real pushers of this purity movement within the church, a movement which he later found to be aversive, and he eventually deconverted. But he was instrumental in kind of building this culture that ultimately drove him away from the church. So, and this, it probably is not a coincidence that a lot of the deconverts that you see are ministers or people who are involved in ministry, and they're kind of selling what drives them away.
A question I suppose I had, because as I was reading your article, I was resonating with it, but I also found some of the things you're saying more extreme than what I was used to. So I guess my question for you is, in your research, have you seen those things happen kind of in different degrees for people?
Oh, yeah. No. And I mean, if you take each of the things that I just mentioned, each of the 5 things that I just mentioned, to its extreme, what you've just defined is your average cult. And so religion lays along a spectrum, and that spectrum goes from sort of a vague Unitarianism to like the extremes, which are cults. And the more a church approaches a cult-like environment, the more likely it is to produce deconverts.
I mean, I really appreciate that comment, because there is a perception that what makes something a cult is the quality of its beliefs doctrinally, rather than a lot of these are social in nature. And of course, cults are social systems, not inherent beliefs. That's why cults can revolve around religion, but also politics and fitness and all kinds of other stuff. So I just think that's a really important comment for people to see, that even within churches with really great doctrine, these things can still exist and be harmful to people. In the article you sent me, you talk about the preventative principle. And that sounds like a good thing. Like you would think, like a church leader would be like, oh, the preventative principle. Yes, we want this to like prevent deconstruction or deconversion and deconstruction, I suppose. But it's not necessarily like a good thing. So I just love for you to unpack that a little bit so we can understand what is the preventative principle.
So the preventative principle is related to the trigger event. And I say that because the preventative principle is what the thing that is keeping you from actually considering the possibility that religion might be wrong. Now, the preventative principle could be a wide variety of things. Frequently, it's the religious environment in which you're in. You're in this religious environment, and to ask questions or consider that you might be wrong about religion would be disloyal to the environment. And so this loyalty you feel towards your fellow Christians within this environment is what is preventing you from asking those questions. Or it could be a sense of guilt, what will God think if I start asking these questions, kind of thing.
Yeah. Or if I change my beliefs on a doctrinal distinctive, I might be rejected by my community, or I might lose my job. Those are ones that I felt for sure.
Many of the deconverts that I looked at were involved in ministry in some way, and oftentimes they were making their living off of the ministry. So yes, but the preventative principle, in one instance, the girl's father was a apologist, and so she'd been raised her entire life with this idea that there are answers to every question that could possibly come up about Christianity. And because she was so confident that all questions could be answered, she didn't bother asking the questions. So her preventative principle in that instance was just high confidence that these questions had answers. And so these preventative principles are what keep you from asking the questions. Now, you mentioned that it sounded like a good thing for a minister. The reason I would say it's not a good thing is because I think it would probably be healthier to ask the questions than to just have some principle that's holding you back from asking those questions.
Right. What's being prevented is the engagement with the questions, not really the deconversion. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Right. And so in a sense, it's, this might be verging more into your opinion than your research, but is it better to remove preventative principles? I guess that's what you kind of just said. You think it would be better to remove preventative principles and allow people to ask the questions than not. Would you agree with that?
Uh, Not as stated. The preventative principle is there or isn't. It's something going on in this person's mind or life that's, keeping them from asking the questions. Um, but I think that an environment which encourages healthy inquiry and asking of those questions versus trying to push them to the back of your mind and pretend that they aren't concerns is a healthier environment. So, rather than removing preventative principles, I would say the environment should encourage healthy engagement with questions. I would put it this way. Imagine that you were raised in a house where every surface was wiped down every hour with a disinfectant, that you know, you were taking 3 showers a day. Like it was a germ-free environment. And then at age 18, you walk out the door into the real world. First thing that's going to happen is you're going to get sick.
Right.
Because you haven't been exposed to those things which strengthen your immune system. And so access to what the outside world believes actually may strengthen rather than hinder one's ability to maintain one's faith.
Hey, we're going to take a quick break from the interview to talk about today's sponsor. That's right. The Truth Snack Podcast has a sponsor for the first time. I've never done an ad read before. I'm actually kind of nervous. So here we go. Feeling the tension of your doubt? Take a leap of faith, literally. Today's sponsor is Belief Bungee. Plunge into uncertainty, bounce back with belief, and let the thrill of faith course through your veins. Doubt can stay grounded while you soar to new spiritual heights. Sorry, I should have read that. I should have read this before. I don't know actually if Belief Bungee is going to be like super helpful if you're going through doubt, but there is something I do really believe in that I think will help. It's a Truth Snack series called Faith, Doubt, and Everything in Between. It's actually designed to do what Joel is talking about in the interview, to make it easier for doubting Christians to bring up their questions in church. The series has 3 parts, each addressing a different question. Is God mad that I'm doubting? Why am I doubting? And how do I overcome doubt? This series includes videos, discussion questions, and more. So it's perfect for any group where there's time for teaching and then discussion afterward. You can download the series for free at truthsnack.ca/resources. Sorry about that. That other sponsor, I don't know if that's a great fit for Truth Snack. We'll have to, look around and see if we can find another sponsor. But let's get back to the interview. I'm enjoying the interview because it's always humbling when I'm struggling to keep up or say it in a way that is acceptable to my interviewee. It's like, no, not quite doing that. I interviewed a philosopher last year, and at the end of the whole interview, I said, "So what you're saying is this?" And they were like, "No." I was like, "Oh man." I was like, I'm embarrassed. I was genuinely embarrassed. So this is where kind of in the interview, I guess we're venturing into maybe more of your opinion or the pastoral stuff, or just maybe personal questions I have. Okay. I resonated a lot with the causes, that you had talked about, those conditions. Mm-hmm. And yet I have not deconverted. Okay. I don't think that makes me special or different. I'm sure that's happened with lots of people. Mm-hmm. But I'm kind of curious, like, have you seen anything where those conditions would be present and where that people haven't deconverted? So I guess I'm just asking, like, what have you seen that actually helps people? Because that's the heart of Truth Snack, is to be hopeful about faith and actually offer people a path forward if that's the path they would like to take.
One thing that really grabbed my attention in the research was this idea of compulsory certainty. And, in looking into that, one of the most effective strategies for deconverting a person, should you ever wish to do so, or for bringing a person over to your point of view, is to access this idea of certainty. You go to them and say, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, how certain are you that, fill in the blank? And then if they give you a 10, you would say, okay, how do you justify that level of certainty? Go ahead. Tell me how it is you can be that certain 100% with no doubts that such and such is the case. And then they have to, go through a lot of labor in order to justify the certainty. And you and I both know that no amount of labor is going to give you 100% certainty. There's always going to be room for doubt. But if they give less than a 10, you say, okay, so clearly you have some doubts. Let's dig into those. What is causing you to doubt? Why is it not a 10? And then you access their doubts and bring those to the forefront. And that's a good way of talking them out of a position.
I think kind of culturally, maybe this is a product of just modernism. We want to be certain. We want that absolute 100% certainty. It's not uniquely Christian. It's also kind of maybe just more generally cultural in the West. And you're saying that just pointing out that people can't be certain is enough to kind of rattle them sometimes.
Now, right. I brought that up to suggest this. There is an alternative, which is called intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is the recognition from the get-go, from the forefront, that I have a limited cognitive capacity. I'm not big brain, right? My brain's sitting inside of my skull. It's limited in size. And my ability to perceive the world around me is limited to my five senses, which are not always that accurate. And, maybe I'm not able to understand all the thing the philosopher is saying over here, or the, psychologist is saying over here.
Yeah, I was just about to say, or the guest psychologist on your podcast.
Yeah. Right, exactly. So recognizing this to be so, then you understand that certainty is an impossibility, not because what your leanings or your beliefs are false, but rather because you have intellectual limitations. And so intellectual humility is the recognition that I, as an individual, cannot have total certainty because I have limitations. Now, if you operate off of that idea, then you're comfortable with uncertainty and you're motivated to learn more. Now, intellectual confidence is the opposite of that. The intellectual confidence is the idea that I can be certain and I am certain, and I'm going to defend that certainty. That's the sort of pride cometh before a fall approach, because the more certainty you claim to have, the harder you fall when that's deflated. But intellectual humility gives you permission to recognize that, hey, I don't know this not because it's wrong, but rather because I'm limited in my capacity to know things.
Yeah, that's a really big approach shift, I think, for a lot of people, including Christians, because you kind of hear that same street epistemology thing where someone asks the atheist, do you know everything? No, of course I don't know everything. Oh, well then, isn't it possible that there's a part of reality where God is and you don't understand it yet, or you haven't discovered it? And they go, well, yeah, I suppose that's possible. And then they go, aha, you should be an agnostic, not an atheist. It sounds like you're just saying, though, that kind of both sides can just point at each other, like, that Spider-Man meme, and just say, like, well, you're not 100% sure. It's like, well, you're not 100% sure. It's like, well, no one's 100% sure. That's not what we're trying to base this on. For the Christian who is deconverting, to realize that could help them reconsider an approach to faith that would be different.
My dear departed father told me that when I die and get to heaven, I'm going to realize I was wrong about a lot of things.
Right.
And that's kind of the fundamental principle of intellectual humility, is this understanding that, no, I don't know it all. I can't know it all. But what I can do is ask the questions and learn more. So intellectual humility, it's the willingness to change your mind, but it's also the understanding that you cannot know everything and have total certainty. So you have to be comfortable with doubts, honestly.
I think that is important. And those are the people that Truth Snack and this podcast are speaking to, those who are experiencing doubts and are probably at a point where they're willing to address them. And so they need to find a way to work through them. And the people that I'm aiming to speak to with this podcast are those who have had kind of their trigger event and are actually willing to take a look at these hard things. So I think that's actually very helpful.
In 2009, there was a researcher, Roel Adams, who discovered that the majority of deconversions were occurring from fundamentalist churches. Now, for me, that wasn't too helpful because the definition of fundamentalism can be all over the map. But thankfully, he did provide his definition, and his definition is something akin to total certainty, or the idea that if you are not totally certain, that the other option is nihilism. That's the key of what I think is the church puts these false dichotomies into place everywhere, where either the Bible is 100% literally true or God doesn't exist. Now, if those are if those are the two options you put in front of people, when one of those they come to the conclusion is not true, they're obviously going to go to the other one because those are the points that you've given them. Or worse, if you don't believe in 6-day creation, then you don't believe in God. Well, I don't believe in 6-day creation, so I guess I don't believe in God.
Yeah, in a way, it's almost like you are telling people to deconvert.
Yeah, you're giving them two options.
Yeah, right. And maybe, and this is kind of circling back, but we didn't talk about the difference between rescuing content versus rescuing belief. Like if they have to rescue a certain piece of content, like young Earth creationism, in order to be a Christian at all, that's different than them going, well, maybe rescuing the belief of God, saying, well, maybe I can believe in God and actually have a different model of how the world came to be.
Yeah, no, that's a good way of putting it. So just to give the audience an idea of what you're talking about.
Sure.
When a person is in the process of deconverting or asking the questions that may lead to deconversion, sometimes they try to rescue their belief. It would be uncomfortable to lose their belief. And then they go one of two routes. Either they try to rescue content, meaning that every single specific teaching that I've been given in church must be true in order for me to be a Christian. Then you have to go through with a fine-tooth comb and a pair of tweezers to figure out how we can make all of these individual teachings to be absolutely true. Or rescue belief is a much less difficult route to go because it says, well, maybe if I rethink some of these things I've been told, maybe if I take another approach, maybe if I allow that some of the things I've been taught were incorrect and have led to me misunderstanding it, then I can remain a believer. So when you're rescuing content, you're rescuing specific things you've been taught. When you rescue belief, you're just basically trying to remain a believer through any means possible.
Yeah, rescuing belief seems a lot more open in terms of asking the question, is there any way I can believe this is true? Versus This is the only way I can believe this is true. Thank you so much for coming on to chat about this and for laying it out. I really enjoyed talking about it more. So thank you for taking so much time to do that.
Not a problem. I enjoyed it.
Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. I wanted to touch in at the end of the episode to say that a lot of what Joel discussed and presented is uncomfortable, but I wanted to bring some clarity to it. What I want to really highlight is that if we accept that we don't know everything and we remain intellectually open to the fact that we can change our mind, then when there are stressors in our faith, we can ask ourselves the question, is there something here that I've been taught that isn't true that is causing this stress? If that's the case, then it's not unfaithful to change our minds. In fact, it'll actually bring us closer to the truth. So navigating doubt will sometimes look like keeping our beliefs, or having our beliefs mature and deepen, or having our beliefs change a little. If you'd like to keep up with Joel and his research, he has a Facebook page called Switching Sides, Research on Atheist and Religious Conversion. I think it's worth following. And if you have something to add, please don't hesitate to reach out at matt@truthsnack.ca. Until next time.